Well, good morning, everyone. We'll start right on time, and welcome to this session. I am Alice Park, Senior Health Correspondent at Time, and it's really my pleasure to be part of this discussion this morning, where we'll be discussing one of the most important breakthroughs, I think, in medicine in recent years, and that is, of course, the GLP-1 based weight loss medications. But before we get into it, just wanted to do brief introductions here. To my immediate left, Stefan Sebastian Boltz, who is the Chief Scientific Officer at Afaya Pharma, and he's also a professor at University of Toronto. To his left, Punit Dhillon, CEO and Chairman of Skye Bioscience, and Dr. Beverly Tchang, Assistant Professor of Clinical Medicine at Weill Cornell Medical College. So before we start, I thought we would lay the groundwork a bit and get an understanding, put some context to the obesity epidemic and the impact that this new class of medications is having. So a couple of statistics. It's a lot of numbers, but I think they'll be important for the discussion this morning. Very recently, in the past month, we've seen the latest statistics which show that overweight and obesity rates have more than doubled in the past 3 decades globally. So that's now affecting 2.1 billion adults and nearly 500 million children. And these rates aren't showing any signs of slowing down. By 2050, 60%, that's 2 out of 3, 2/3 of adults will be overweight or obese. 33%, 1 in 3 children and teens will be overweight or obese. And not only that, this is not a problem. It's currently sort of focused on the developed countries, but it is very quickly appearing in low and middle income countries as well. By 2050, that 1 in 3 young people who are overweight or obese will be in North Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Caribbean. But as we know, these new weight loss medications are really transforming obesity and how we manage obesity, both for the good and the bad. But let's just understand that right now it's projected that these drugs will bring in $100 billion annually by 2030. That's just 5 years away. And this month, just in March, it became the best-selling class of drugs worldwide. So just for some context, in 2024, the best-selling class, or the best-selling drug was Keytruda for cancer treatment, one of the immunotherapies, and that brought in $30 billion. So we're talking a 3-fold increase here. Clearly a game changer, clearly something that I'm sure everyone in this room, just a show of hands, how many people have heard of these drugs, are on them, or know someone who is? Okay, I think that's pretty
Can I just
typical.
add, about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, maybe I would have gotten one hand, actually, if I asked that question. So I think getting a pulse of even not just the statistics, but just from you guys, really shows the power of these medications.
And that's a good segue into the first question, which, Punit, I'd like to start with you. Why has it taken this long for us to get to this point? You know, these are drugs that target a group of hormones called the incretins, and we've known about them for decades. Why, and there's been other classes of anti-obesity medications, why has it taken us this long, and why has this group of drugs taken off the way that it has?
Yeah, Alice, that's a great place to start. A fascinating question. You know, I would say there's kind of three parts to that. One is that the definition of obesity has finally been understood to be a chronic condition. So you have this complexity of it being defined as an appetite thing or a caloric restriction aspect or more of a willpower-driven aspect to finally understanding it's a chronic condition. And because of that, you had limited investment coming into that market or lack of understanding of how complex the disease is. The second has been really the safety of the first-generation drugs. So if you go back to the 90s, there has been a history of issues related to the first generation of these medicines. If you go back to fen-phen or even some of the earlier generation of the drugs that are currently been approved. And then the third is the complexity of the disease is much better understood. So you have this aspect that it's not just about calories in versus calories out. Like, as you mentioned, there's gut hormones, there's genetic medicine that's improved, AI-driven improvements in terms of the medicine development. There's also this wide change in the regulatory environment that's allowed for investment to come into the market to actually advance the drug development. So you've seen, I think, on all three of these different avenues, a rapid shift. And because of that, now we've finally seen huge improvement in terms of the effectiveness of these drugs. And with even the nascent industry that it is, there's only 7 drugs that are approved. And of those 7, I think 3 of them have been the most effective in terms of the last few years, in terms of that have gotten the wider adoption, as some of the audience members have indicated that their familiarity with it.
Stefan.
So there's a fun fact about all this, because this was never, Ozempic or semaglutide was never developed in the first place as an anti-obesity drug. It was developed as a drug against diabetes. And it was actually approved to treat diabetes in 2004. And then it was found, in all those trials, the patients lose weight. They reported this. And so the companies got wind of it and actually reacted accordingly. So in 2022, we got this approval for weight loss, right? So it was a long way, and it was actually developed for something else. And we see those patterns very frequently in medicine. Viagra was developed as an antihypertensive. When Fleming found penicillin, he just saw that a fungus actually stopped bacterial growth and made the right conclusions. So this is important when you think about why it took so long. It was never meant to treat obesity. And this is why everything we know about obesity, and we collect the data, we just talked about this earlier today, we're about to learn what it does to obesity, what it does to obese patients, right? Where it started more recently than we have the drug. So I think it's an important fact.
I think that's a very important point, and I know that it's used interchangeably, but for diabetes, the medications are actually Ozempic and Mounjaro, and for obesity, it's Wegovy and Zepbound. So, Beverly, I wanted to turn to you and ask you, what impact are you seeing these medications have? And again, addressing from the clinical perspective, what you saw before treating patients with obesity, since that's your specialty, and what impact you're seeing these drugs make, both positive and negative.
I think these medications have made people realize that obesity is a disease. So, and Punit had said that earlier. This isn't us from the medical community trying to medicalize something, or pharma trying to get drugs into people's hands and increase everyone's revenue that way. What we're finally recognizing is that excess weight is controlled by so many factors. Yes, maybe what you eat and how much you move is one half of the equation, but there's also a real biology and kind of hormonal imbalances that we're realizing that we've never addressed before, that the wellness industry has never addressed before. And this is why we can go to Weight Watchers and Jenny Craig and all of these other companies that have gone bust or are almost going to go bust because they just haven't worked. Right? And they haven't worked because we haven't addressed the excess weight issue from the biology side of it until now, until we have these medications. And so when patients start on these medications, it just reinforms them. It's like, oh yeah, there was something wrong with my hormones. I've been saying that all along. I've been coming into my doctors and saying, I'm doing everything right, I'm exercising, I'm eating what you're telling me to, but I'm still not losing the weight. Can you check my hormones? I think there's something off there. And we do as a doctor. We check like thyroid. We try our best, but we didn't have all of the information, and we still don't have all the information. But now that we have a medication that helps address the balance of one of those hormones, that GLP-1 hormone, we can say, and that it's working, we can say, oh, that hormone is probably one of the problems in your body, because when we fix that balance, you lose weight. And you're doing all of the same things. You're exercising. You're doing all of the quote-unquote right things. Before we weren't addressing your biology. Now we're addressing your biology, and now it's working. So I think because of that personal experience, everyone is now believing us and themselves and the community that weight management is not just it's not a lifestyle issue. It is both. There's a lifestyle and there's a biology component to it.
And considering now obesity as a chronic condition with biological underpinnings, what are the implications for that, Punit, from the industry perspective? You know, this is a huge market, a huge new target. We, for decades, have been treating almost everything else, you know, associated with this chronic condition, heart disease, diabetes, with medications. And now, for the first time, we've got, as Beverly was saying, a drug, a prescription for obesity. So what does that mean from an industry perspective as far as understanding then making obesity a medical condition that's treatable medically?
Yeah, and I think that's Stefan and Beverly both kind of touched on this. There's a wide complexity to this condition that's not just linked to the gut hormones. There's components of, as Stefan indicated, you know, diabetes is where some of these medicines were first utilized. So the aspect of insulin sensitivity or the aspect of better sensitivity to appetite-regulating hormones, which are yet another system. So the endocrinology, or the what we like to even frame it as maybe like a broader metabolic wiring that has to be looked at, links this disease to many different factors, and those are different pathways that we can address in medicine, and those are different pathways that are also linked to other comorbidities associated with this disease. So I think for us, in terms of when we're looking at pharmaceutical development, we are trying to be holistic in terms of that understanding. We believe that obviously GLP-1s have made a significant impact, but that is just the beginning of the frontier in terms of where things are headed. Skye, for instance, is working on an interesting new pathway that's called CB1 inhibition. It's been around.
I want to stop you there because we're going to get to that, future. But I wanted to bring Stefan in and talk about some of these indications Punit raised. And we already have a change in the label for these medications in reducing heart disease, sleep apnea. I think studies are underway for looking at kidney and liver issues. So it's clear that addressing obesity from a biological, physiological perspective is really having wide-ranging impacts. Can you talk a little bit about some of these other indications and what may be on the horizon that we can expect now that we understand how sort of fundamental, as Beverly was saying, this obesity is physiologically?
Yeah, again, maybe a historical perspective helps a little bit. The term incretin actually comes from secretion and insulin, because it has been known for 90 years, or 93 years to be exact, that there is hormones being released from the small intestine that actually induce the release of glucose from the pancreas. This is where this whole idea, the word, comes from. And so since then, people have been thinking about what's going on, have tried to put sense into all this and get a mechanistic understanding of what's happening. And again, the first idea was, again, glucose-centric, I would call it. How can we treat diabetes? And this is when Dan Drucker in Toronto, I like to say, cloned and GLP-1, and it got on the market. We had something in our hands to start the treatment, as Punit just said. We had something to show what's possible. And we can now scale what kind of effect we can achieve. And this is fascinating because it also taught us how delicately built we all are. Right? How delicately built and adapted we are to our environment. Actually, this is very unfortunate, not the environment we live in. We actually adapted and perfectly adapted to an environment where there's not enough food and where you would sometimes see a berry here and there and you eat it because it's almost pure glucose, which you need for your brain, which is our evolutionary advantage. So that actually means that now with a surplus of food, in a composition that have never been adapted for, far too many proteins, far too many lipids, we actually don't do well. And what we're trying to do now is we're trying to decipher what is really happening, and what do all these results tell us about ourselves. How can we get into this better, and how can we kind of be more precise with our treatments? And to everything you already implied, those incretins act not only on the pancreas, on the liver, because they are GLP-1 receptors. They can also live long enough to reach the brain via the bloodstream to actually act on brain centers. This is why they can decrease satiety, but they're also psychotropic. We know that, and there's discussions and actually trials to test whether GLP-1 can affect depression, can actually affect mood swings, because it's inbuilt into how this whole thing is hardwired. And what's far more important, and this is what GLP-1 doesn't do when you give it as a drug, the endogenous GLP-1 acts on nerve fibers in the gut that directly project into your brain. And we're hardwired. So we're learning all this, and I think when we talk about what's coming up, this is the next avenue. But I wouldn't exclude any indication from being accessible to GLP-1, because it's so broad. And we're standing there like kids almost, and in astonishment to see what else comes next day, right?
Right.
If you want to have an idea of what the next frontier is for these medications, just think about, or talk to someone with obesity, think about yourself if you've experienced unintentional weight gain, and think about how that weight has affected your life, right? Did it cause you to not eat out as much or want to not eat out as much? Did it make you buy healthier foods? Did it make you buy new clothes? Did it make you not want to go out as much? How did it affect your life? And then reverse all of that. Because that's what we're seeing when we treat patients, right? I'm based in New York City, so a lot of my patients live in apartments. I know we're in Texas, so think very, very small, like one of your rooms, right? One of your rooms, and you have to climb four flights of stairs to get to one of your rooms. And one of my patients was like, before she was on these GLP-1s, she was looking for a new apartment and limiting herself to elevator-only buildings. And I can tell in New York City, that's like twice the cost of what you would get with a regular non-elevator fancy building. Now that she's on a GLP-1, she feels so much better. She can walk. She doesn't have to keep buying bigger and bigger clothes. Now she has to buy smaller and smaller clothes, which is a different problem. Like maybe a good problem to have, but she's getting to a point of stability in her life where she doesn't have to worry about what to wear. She knows she's going to fit into this. She feels good and comfortable with her body and who she sees, what other people see her as is what she thinks she is. You know, there's like sort of unification of that identity. And she's saving money because she doesn't have to look for an elevator building. And so if you want to think about where else, what other industries are these medications going to make an impact, just think about your own personal experience and what decisions you've had to make because of unintentional weight gain and reverse all of that, because that's what we're seeing.
And I think, imagine applying that to even beyond obesity-related issues, but as Stefan was pointing out, it's now being studied for addiction, depression, as you said, and because it impacts the same reward centers in the brain for satiety, for appetite, there's very interesting and solid work indicating that it could be useful in alcohol and substance abuse as well. Not to mention, I know that the companies that make these drugs are actively studying it for Alzheimer's and dementia. So apply that, what Beverly was saying, to not just obesity-related health issues and the psychology around that, but to other chronic conditions as well, and you get an idea for the impact that these medications could have. Punit, I want to turn to you now and have you address, now that we've had the door opened by these GLP-1s, what else is this catalyzing in the industry, and what is Skye looking at in terms of new targets, new physiological targets, now that we know that this is possible?
Yeah, I think so. The medicine's definitely moving towards, I would say, personalization, precision, and underlying metabolic kind of effects. So there's targets out there and pathways that, like we're discussing, that go beyond just these gut hormones that are also relevant we're working on one that has actually had validation in weight loss before. If you go back a decade or more, it showed CB1 inhibition, which is a target that's expressed on multiple different tissues that can convert simply fat to energy. It actually showed about 10% weight loss in previous studies, and it was a drug that was approved by Sanofi. Research was done by Pfizer, Merck. We are working on a next generation of that drug that addresses some of the safety concerns of the first generation that penetrated the brain and led to issues such as depression and in severe cases, suicide ideation. So we're focused on kind of targeting that receptor below the neck and just in the body. But there's other interesting pathways too, like amylin, and this is where the science is headed, is that everything is about, I think, looking at multi-target approaches that can more comprehensively look at things beyond just absolute weight loss. So I think the discussion has been there in the last few years where we've seen, headlines talk about how much weight people have lost, but the conversation, I think, is finally shifting towards recognizing what the quality of weight loss should be, the sustainability of what the metabolic changes that people are looking at beyond just the aspect of weight loss. So that's how we are looking at things, is looking at how we can improve tolerability, improve some of the unmet needs that have come along with today's medicines that have gotten a lot of notoriety and they work effectively, but there's still patients that are not responding. There's still patients that have a huge amount of tolerability issues, and there's a kind of a capture of those and help to still make the metabolic gains that people are expecting to have without just focusing on weight loss alone.
Do you anticipate that we will be targeting one or the other of these systems, or, physiological processes, or looking at combinations of them? Like, would your product be used in conjunction with a GLP-1?
I think that's the beauty. So we were already evaluating that. In fact, we're evaluating our drug in combination with GLP-1. So we'll have a data readout later this year on that. And it's the first time that you'll see that data with combining CB1 inhibition with GLP-1. But that's already been seen in incretins. So incretins have moved beyond just GLP-1 alone. And Stefan's been very modest about this, but University of Toronto has been at the forefront of not only insulin, but at GLP-1 as well. So if you go back 100 years, these drugs came out of that institution. They would have been the largest pharma company if they hadn't licensed the technology to Novo and Lilly early in the days. So it's just interesting that how the evolution of the space has been. But the single incretins have obviously made an impact. Now there's dual, and there's going to be
Right, so Mounjaro and Zepbound already are targeting two, and I know that the companies are looking at triple.
That's right. So then you go beyond the incretins to combinations of incretins with non-incretins, looking at these other opportunities in terms of metabolic effects. So CB1 is an interesting pathway. We're looking at that. There's already data, and today was another announcement of CagriSema data, I think on phase 3, which is amylin and GLP-1. So there's a mix and match that is being evaluated across the industry to see what the improvements are. And if you think about it, and Dr. Tchang can probably address this better, is that, remember, obesity is such a heterogeneous issue. It's not one size fits all. So you have to think about this very holistically about what improvements we can have across the spectrum of different patients in all shapes and sizes. Maybe you can elaborate on that a bit.
I mean, there's so many times that I see people and they tell me, I'm not really eating that much to begin with. And the thing with all of our weight loss medications today is that they primarily work for weight loss by reducing appetite. You're reducing portion sizes, we're reducing cravings, that food noise. And so you're working on the food intake side of the problem. But for some people, their appetite isn't that big to begin with, and they're not really eating that much already, and there's a metabolism problem. So the question is always, is there something that will reawaken my metabolism? And we don't have that right now. We have maybe a couple of medications, phentermine, for example, or another one called phentermine plus topiramate, which is branded under Qsymia, that might have some increased energy expenditure effect, so it increases your metabolism burn, but it hasn't really been proven in any of the data yet. But really, we have a whole area of the biology that we just haven't figured out yet, and that's the metabolism piece. Like, what tells the body to store calories versus burn them? We don't really know. Certainly, if you're actively running and doing some physical activity, probably your body's going to want those calories available to burn than to store. But we can't tell people to be running marathons all the time. It's just not practical. It doesn't make sense. So right now, all of our medications, again, work on the food intake, but there's nothing for the metabolism. And I think certain medications like the CB1 receptor inverse agonist that Punit is developing, some of these other medications in the pipeline, you might have heard of like bimagrumab or other kind of mouthfuls. They all work on the metabolism side. And I think in the future, our next generation of medications is going to be a combination of something that controls appetite, whether it be Wegovy, Ozempic, Mounjaro, Zepbound, plus something that works on the metabolism side as well.
Stefan, you were shaking your head when I was asking the question about looking at combinations and where we might be in a few years as we see newer classes and newer targets come out. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was not in disagreement, but I think one thing that you always have to keep in mind when you, and this is very laudable to combine two drugs, when you combine two drugs, you accumulate effects, but you also accumulate side effects. And that makes drug development of combination drugs extremely difficult and expensive. And sometimes, and actually the rate of failure is quite high. So I think we have to do it. I think this is absolutely necessary and we should try it out, but it's, as I said, it's laudable and it's risky, right? So that's why I nodded, kind of shook my head, because we have to, when we look at all these developments, we have to, I think, always reflect on, and this is what Beverly just said, whom are we treating? And what is the real problem in this very kind of heterogeneous group of obese people? And I think this is what we need to get to. And we need to understand whether we need to increase metabolism or whether we need to reduce food intake or both, or activity in general, right? We discussed this earlier. It's a societal decision what we want to do, how we want to treat this, because our treatment has to be as complex as the problem. We cannot go in with just one silver bullet because we don't have it. And I think this is what we need to understand. And I just when Punit talked about this, no, actually when Beverly said about the metabolism, I sat on a panel in London some time ago, and there was a company, and I'm blanking on the name, and I shouldn't, out of Stanford. And what they do is borderline crazy, but absolutely fascinating. They actually thought about squirrels. And squirrels hibernate, but as bears, they actually wake up for a few minutes or a few hours and then go back into hibernation. They're fully operational in between. That actually means that they jack up their metabolism within minutes and then go back to sleep, right? A cool thing. And the question really is the $1 million question or more is, how does this work? What orchestrates this waking up, get metabolism back, and go back into hibernation? And this is the gold rush part of everything we do. There's so many good ideas, and I mean, the sky is the limit. We will see what comes. But this is one of those things where we just need to try to understand what's happening and how do we best react. And I think that's important. And with GLP-1 is the door opener. GLP-1 agonists like Wegovy or Ozempic, semaglutide, has shown us what's possible, and now we need to deal with this with the knowledge, right? That's possible. Of course, we can lose weight with a drug, which is actually a new finding. But how do we do this more responsibly? How do we do this? We do not need to lose weight. I mean, like 20% in 13 weeks, because we'll regain them mercilessly right after, right? So we have to think about all these things, and again, it's a societal thing. We have to agree on this, we have to agree on programs and so on, we have to pay for programs, otherwise it will not work, I would say.
I want to address two of the things that you raised, Stefan, which is the side effects, of course. No drug is without side effects, and also this broader question of how we're redefining and reframing our discussion and management of obesity and what needs to happen, as these new classes keep coming on board for us to do it safely and effectively. But let's start with side effects first. And Beverly, what are you seeing with your patients in terms of, we've heard about the gastrointestinal effects, we're seeing reports about eye and vision issues. What are you seeing as far as balancing, people who are balancing the benefits of weight loss, the cardiometabolic benefits they're seeing, and the potential side effects?
I think people have to remember that these medications isn't a set it and forget it type of intervention. Really, you should be working with a medical doctor or provider or medical team to see what dose do I start on, when do I increase it, should I increase it, should I decrease it, can I take anything over the counter if there are side effects for...
Well, what is the normal course? Because the whole point is that there is like a gradual increase and then a drop off, and it's a 9-month period. Just walk us through what the prescription looks like.
So if you're on Wegovy, for example, you start at 0.25 milligrams, and then typically every month that increases to 0.5, 1.0, 1.7, or 2.4. A lot of people seem to land at 1.7 or 2.4. And this is according to the manufacturer's instructions. For Zepbound, it's 2.5 milligrams, and then that increases by another 2.5 every month until you land somewhere on either 5, 10, or 15 milligrams. So there's a lot of pathways that you can end up on. And what's really important is working with a provider to see, does it make sense for you to keep increasing? Are you having too many side effects even at the lowest dose? Then that might mean that medication isn't for you. Or you might work with a provider like me where I work a little bit outside the box and we talk about microdosing some of these medications, and maybe we can even do tiny doses to find that best balance between effect and side effect. I'll say that we're not seeing anything in terms of kind of the biggest concerns you've flagged, whether it's kidney, eye issues, depression, mental, anything like that. We're not really seeing any of that. By and large, we're seeing patients who are getting the benefit from the medications. And yes, they're having some side effects like nausea or heartburn, reflux, which are the most common ones. But what we're realizing is the benefits outweigh those side effects, which typically go away in a week or maybe at most a month. And they're finding that this is the pathway forward for them, because the question is, what would the alternative be? If the alternative is not the medication and doing, diet and exercise over and over again like they've been doing for 10 years already and it just hasn't worked, then they want to continue trying the medication.
So now that we have these medications that are helping people to lose the largest percentage of their body mass that we've ever had, it's really opened the door to understanding how we can manage obesity in a completely different way. Punit, I wanted to ask you from an industry perspective, that means also redefining our sense of what's quote unquote healthy, and what role does the industry and companies like yourself that are developing these medications, what responsibility and role do you feel you can play in helping to define that in a way that's safe and effective for patients?
Yeah, so I think that it's been clear that medical intervention in this space, or having anti-obesity drugs available, is not the set it and forget it, as Dr. Tchang kind of put it really perfectly, because a lot of people, I think, are taking advantage of the drugs without also recognizing that this is to be done in conjunction with lifestyle changes. So I think the industry has a constant responsibility to continue to educate that anti-obesity medications have to be taken in conjunction with lifestyle changes, and recognize that in order to have long-term sustainable benefit of anti-obesity medication, there is a component of, there is a requirement to stay on these drugs over a long period of time. So I think it's a common misconception here that you can take the drug and you can have this desired outcome, and then you can come off the drug and you're going to still be able to sustain that outcome that you got. And you can see based on the evidence there is a pretty common kind of rebound effect that comes along with coming off of AOMs. So that's where I think there's a difference, and this is where I think the medical professionals and industry are very aligned, that you want to help patients get to those long-term goals of being less reliant on AOMs, but there is a long road ahead before we can get there. And
Wait, I have the perfect analogy for this, and I help this with my patients because I think there's an idea where you use the medication to jumpstart you, and then you do something else. And the way I like to explain it is if you were driving a car and you want to go from 0 to 60, you got to push on the gas pedal, right? I don't drive a car in New York City, but for you guys must know this, right? So, but if you want to stay at 60, you have to keep your foot on the gas pedal. That's the same idea. So whether that gas pedal is physical activity or a new nutrition plan, the keto diet, what have you, or medication, you got to keep your foot on the gas pedal. It has to be a sustained intervention. And sometimes I think we apply this double standard to medications where you should just give it and it should just work, have a permanent effect on your body, which I don't know why we would want, but that's not the case, right? Because diet changes. A keto diet doesn't have a permanent effect on your body. You know, if you try a diet strategy, it works until you stop. And then if you stop doing that nutrition plan, you regain the weight. And that's the same thing, whether it's physical activity or medication. So you got to keep your foot on the gas pedal.
And I would just say, one thing is, like, I don't think it should be conceived as that medicine is evil or the pharma companies are evil in this regard. Like there's this evolution of also thinking about this in terms of how the medicine's becoming a bit more personalized for that patient as well. So to Dr. Chang's point, like you're getting that jump start, you're wanting to see that improvement alongside of lifestyle changes, but look at how fast the medicine's also moving. You're seeing now, as it was discussed on the panel, microdosing, different dosing regimens, maybe going to a monthly dosing, still having some level of intervention that's keeping it in check for the patient while they're still trying to make those other changes. So this is a very complex disease. There is behavioral components associated with the disease alongside of the medical interventions, but behavioral change doesn't happen overnight. So there's, I think, a broader understanding that's still underway, and I believe industry's doing a really good job of keeping up. And you can see that in terms of big pharma. Big pharma is making those investments beyond just the pipeline, beyond just the drug development. You can see some of the collaborations that have been announced that also look at behavioral change associated with helping guide those patients. So you have this, this is what I love about South by Southwest, because you get this cross-section of different industries that are working together to educate the patients.
So Beverly, just really quick, and then we'll come to you, Stefan. What are you seeing, reality check here, what are you seeing with your patients as far as those who start these medications? And a lot of people have described them, as you did, as a jump start. So for people for whom it's been very challenging to change their diet or start exercising because they just haven't seen the results, as you're saying, they haven't seen any effect, and now they're taking these medications and they're seeing that. They're seeing some, they're losing pounds. So for the first time, they're saying, this is something I can do. So as a catalyst, as a jumpstart, what are you seeing with your patients as far as how they're then using the medications? Is it something that you're prescribing once a course, I think it's 9 months or so generally is the typical kind of dosing to go up and then down?
It goes up to, the Wegovy is like 5 months of increasing the dose. Okay. And then Zepbound, even just like 2 months. First month is like the starter dose. You might lose like 2 pounds or 4 pounds in that first month. And then you land on 5 milligrams and about maybe you get 10% of weight loss with the 5 milligrams. So it doesn't have to be 9 months long. You could
But for however long that is, are you seeing then having to re-prescribe, have another prescription, another course, or what are you seeing with your patients as far as typically what they're doing?
Yeah, in reality, we're working with a lot of challenges in this system, primarily cost and insurance. So many people cannot access these medications because insurance just won't cover it, either because insurance doesn't recognize that obesity is a disease worth treating. Like if you had diabetes, that's worth treating, but if it's obesity, it's not worth treating. I don't know why. Or they're trying to implement kind of cost savings programs on their end by saying, okay, we'll treat obesity, but only if your weight is high enough, and only if you already have heart disease. If you've already had a heart attack, we'll treat it. Which is mind-boggling, of course, because you would think that these health insurance companies are incentivized to preserve health. If you have a healthier population that you're taking care of, then there should be fewer costs. But that's actually not their mission. Their mission is affordability, not health outcomes. And that is why we're seeing this continued fight with patients and providers and doctors on one side and insurance on the other, and us saying, no, this patient deserves these medications, but insurance just says, no, we're not going to cover it. And unfortunately, a lot of people fall into that category where their insurances won't access it, won't give them access to it. I think to Stefan's point, this really requires like a massive societal buy-in and just like public outcry about needing access to these medications that can really transform your life. I mean, Punit, you mentioned behavioral changes don't happen overnight. I would argue they do, actually, with these medications. I've had patients start these medications, and it's like a light switch turns off. Before, they had that food noise talking about, what am I going to eat for lunch? And I'm in the middle of eating breakfast, but I'm already thinking about eating lunch. And that just turns off. And again, that sort of reinforms us that, yes, this is a biological problem. I think the social buy-in is so important. Like, we have to, in whatever format we can, be talking to each other, talking to our public representatives, making noise about it, saying, we want access to these medications. Even if I don't know yet whether it's the right one for me, I want to have the option to try it, right? And that's something that we all have to tell our public representatives about, because they're in the middle right now of figuring out, how do we make America healthy again?
So maybe as a comment that expands this a little bit, we have to look at our patients. Who are our patients? If you go to a middle to low income family and tell this family, you know what, you get this drug now, you're going to lose weight, and then I would commend some lifestyle changes. Eat better food. If you really think this through, and this was an editorial 2 days ago in The Lancet, which actually kind of was an eye-opener for me. Food, good food, so it's a British study, good food per calorie is twice as expensive as bad food, fast food. A middle to low income family, just 2 adults, would actually need to spend 40% of their disposable income on that lifestyle change. Good luck. With kids, 70%. This is economically not feasible. And to a certain extent, we're actually discussing this in a bubble here. We're discussing, okay, yeah, lifestyle changes, you know what, a little bit more gym and all these kind of things, good, fine. But the problem is out there. The pipeline is fed by those population groups. And one group we haven't discussed at all yet, which I'm quite passionate about, are the kids. We have no drug for kids below 6 years. And they are feeding the pipeline. We have a massive increase, and you said it before, we have a massive increase in obesity and overweight and obesity in this age group. And if you're obese below the age of 6, you have a 99% chance to be obese when you're an adult. We have nothing to actually tackle this. We need a very broad approach. And it's drugs, it's lifestyle changes, and it's really accessibility and affordability. We have to discuss this. We have to talk about this. We cannot ignore this. Because otherwise, we're going to cure a bubble. This is fine, right? Will apply to most of this room. But we will not get the thing under control. And we're talking about the US, we're talking about Canada, Western Europe, and so on. But I mean, obesity, and Alice said it before, is out there everywhere. I mean, the Gulf region are good; they can afford it. But there's a massive spot for obesity. Latin America is coming close, right? Everywhere. It's not an isolated problem, and it will literally kill us. It's very simple. It will kill our social systems because we cannot afford this. So this is why I'm advocating so massively to really start thinking about it in different ways. We cannot wait for a drug to do the job for us. We have to change, not only us, but the complete social and the economic context. As Punit just said, that's necessary.
And I think a big part of that is the cost of these drugs. You know, we've seen the major pharmaceutical companies come out with lower cash offerings for these medications, which are extremely expensive and they're targeted toward people who are uninsured. But it's still $350 to $500 a month. And as Beverly was saying, you know, often it takes several months on these medications. Punit, I wonder if you can address whether it is possible, but this seems to be the pattern that we've been seeing with new and innovative medications. You know, they're game-changing. We see this very high introduction with very high prices, which the companies come back and say is justified because of the ROI on, you know, future health costs that they save. Are we able to specifically in biotech and even in pharma start to look at ways that we can innovate and introduce medications at lower costs, you know, instead of going through this cycle and having to go through several years of inequities and having people not afford them, often people who need them the most?
Absolutely, and we've already seen that that happen in the industry. If you go back just a few years, we're talking average course of treatment was about $1,500 a month for Wegovy, or I think when that was introduced. Now, you know, just last week we saw that announcement of $499 if you're on the NovoCare program. So you have naturally there was an asymmetry of supply and demand, and that allowed higher prices. And now with that balancing out, there's also new drugs that are coming onto the pipeline. And if you look at specifically the incretin pipeline, it's vast. There's about 40 plus drugs in development in the US and hundreds in development outside of the US. And those are putting pressure. So, you know, no crystal ball here, but it wouldn't take much of a macroeconomic view to recognize that if you have more supply than there is demand, then that price compression is likely to continue to happen. And we've seen that in other therapeutic areas. So we believe that incretins are going to continue to be price compressed, but it's going to allow all of this other stuff that we're talking about take place as well, where combinations, other mechanisms that can work alongside and have that long-term effect take place. And this is the challenge, I think, that now we're going to see, is that how does the policy making come into play specifically on obesity? I mean, there's a good precedent outside of obesity that you can get insurance coverage, but it's yet to be ruled that whether obesity is going to be covered. And I think that the way to counteract that, to Stefan's point, is that employers and others that have the ability to help these patients really have to take a larger stance, right? So if we improve the access to these drugs, and we see the wider change that they're going to take place, it's naturally putting more pressure on the insurers and others that can see that, you know, there's a reason to be involved, or there's economics to be involved. So price compression is going to help with that, as well as broader access to patients through other means. You know, I think we've already seen this in the U.S. where large employers are starting to allow access to their employees on these types of medicines because they see the investment in the future that'll bring down their overall healthcare costs.
And I know that here in the U.S. we are eagerly awaiting to hear the decision from Medicare and Medicaid on whether that'll be covered and whether we start looking at obesity more, as Beverly, you were saying, perhaps in covering it as a preventive, right? And saying we can avoid, especially with young children, avoid a lot of the very expensive chronic conditions from diabetes, liver, kidney issues, heart disease that we see as a result of obesity. So I know that we're eagerly waiting to see what might happen there.
One interesting trend, though, that's taken place is that this therapeutic class has opened the door for direct-to-consumer, I think, in a bigger way than we've seen in other therapeutic classes. So it's not like...
Where the push is coming from the patients,
Yeah, and the push coming from the patients, and pharma is responding with pricing that's making it more accessible. So you don't get that in an oncology drug or others that require specialists to administer. This therapeutic class, I think, is going to be continuing to see more evolution of that as well. And you see that, you know, as these drugs also become genericized, other entrants that have made disruption, like look at the HIMSS example in terms of how disruptive they were when the compounding was allowed under 503A and B.
Right, and that's going to lead to my next question, but before I pose that, wanted to remind everyone we will have Q&A, so if you do have a question for any of our panelists, feel free to, I think there's microphones around the room, feel free to line up and we will address them. But I wanted to ask each of you, as Punit raised, and which we haven't discussed yet, but we've come to the point where perhaps in the next year or so, we're going to see the first data on oral forms of these medications. And even though a lot of people don't have much issue with the injections because they're pretty easy to do, I think the oral drugs will be another game changer and really, again, change the stakes for people and raise this question of how prevalent should these drugs be for people, given the prevalence of chronic conditions. So we've talked about statins. People have argued, you know, maybe they should be put in the water. Corollary to that, with these new classes of weight loss drugs, should the barriers for prescribing them and that currently exist, should they be lowered? Should they be available to more people, especially if they're going to be available in pill form? I want to hear from each one of you. Maybe we can start with you, Stefan.
I don't have a clear answer for this because I think there are definitely two sides to the medal. First of all, of course, it would be good if we could supply this broadly to people, but we would actually give away responsibility. And what we're talking about here is a hormone replacement therapy. It's a hormone, right? And we lack long-term data on the outcome. There are certain data in animals that were just kind of irritating. Right? Because, I mean, GLP-1 at the end of the day, is a growth factor. And there were carcinoma formations in mice. We haven't seen this in the human population yet, but this could be a question of time. Or it could be a question of the population. We have not yet segregated the population enough to have enough data. I think we can all agree on this. And this is why having this, again, of course it would be good to give it to the patient, give it back to the hands of the patient, but I'm a big fan of keeping control. What we also see, and that's interesting, when you look at the data for tirzepatide and for Wegovy in phase 2 clinical trials, where they were coached, calorie restricted, and lifestyle kind of moderated, you saw a much larger effect than in the just recently published head-to-head comparison, right, when it was given and then they were sent home. So something is happening there, everything that Beverly said, right, with the way people behave at home without being coached. We have to learn on these things, and I think we need a moderator and at best a physician in between. I think that would be better. I would not just give it completely free away.
Well, I think also the fact that, you know, there's so much focus on up to 20%, you know, weight loss of your body mass, but 20% for someone with BMI, you know, 30 plus looks and is very different than 20% for someone who's right on that border, right, of BMI of, you know, 29 and just in that borderline of overweight. So I think that's another issue, is this question of how much weight is too much weight loss. And Punit, maybe in responding, you could address that too. Yeah,
I think that's a really valid point here. So both on the oral versus injectable debate, I think it's a wait and see in terms of data. There is still, as kind of Stefan's pointed out, I think leaving it in complete control of how patients take their medicines with orals, like we still have a lot of there may be a concern in terms of just remembering to
You'd have to remember to take a daily pill versus a weekly injection, right?
and the injections could move towards a monthly or even a quarterly. So, but I know Beverly's going to say that. Well, you got to be able to monitor kind of safety and stuff like that along the way. But so I think we're still trying to see what the data looks like on that. For us, obviously moving towards non-invasive method. That's ultimately, I think, where the industry is going. Like today, we're in 2025. In 2035, we're hoping precision, non-invasive, personalized. Those are all what the future of this medicine holds. I think the other side of it, in terms of weight loss percentages, that's the interesting thing. Is when you look at the demographics, the obesity population and overweight population is kind of segregated, kind of archaically in class 1, class 2, class 3. And overweight, but you're absolutely right that the larger amount of the population is in this overweight class 1 population versus the class 2 and class 3. So does everybody require a 20%, 24%, 25% weight loss that these medicines are out there starting to claim? And remember, those numbers that are being utilized, that's a percentage of these trials. That's not the entire population of the trial. It's a median number out of the clinical trials, and that's not translatable necessarily in the real world. So we have to take that into account. For us, we're looking at quality of weight loss and making sure that we are addressing things like tolerability, addressing overall lean mass preservation, and other factors than just focusing on fat loss. And I think that's an important consideration in the long term.
I think my colleagues are hitting on a lot of really good points. I want to highlight, the main question of are we getting the right medication into the right person's hands, right? Back to that kind of individualizing therapy for you, because the cause of your excess weight may be different from your friend's excess weight, right? So is it in the right person's hands? And when we look at future generations of medications, are we going to get to a point where we want to put GLP-1s in the water? I'll say right now, no. Today, that answer is no. But we should have that as a goal, some kind of goal, right? We should have perhaps at some point a weight medication that is safe enough, few side effects, safe enough to maybe prevent 10-pound weight gain, that you can get over the counter without going through seeing doctors and waiting lists and all the blood tests and all of that. And I envision this because we were talking about this earlier with birth control. I think about how women had to go see their gynecologist, see their doctor, wait for 3 months for an appointment, get examined and all of this, and then send it to a pharmacy, pick it up at a pharmacy, and it was a whole week process. And today, you can get it through a pill mill, so to speak. You can get it sent to your door with a piece of chocolate if you want. And it's still safe. And if anything, it's given us so much social benefit. And that's another question as to, what kind of benefits, what's the goal of this? And so we're definitely not at a point now where these GLP-1s can just be delivered to your door with a piece of chocolate, right? But maybe that should be a goal, because if we do get to that point, that means we're reaching a level of safety that we feel comfortable enough with that level of access. And I think sorry, are we running out of time?
No.
Oh, sorry. Well, the other point was what's the goal, right? Is it this BMI? So BMI stands for body mass index. It's this archaic way of establishing who has obesity and what that risk is. And a little bit of history, that BMI was really validated by a man in men, and men are wonderful, but they're not women, right? It's not the same. But interestingly enough, they validated in men from Minnesota, like these businessmen from Minnesota, college men from Minnesota, Roman brick stone layers, South African Bantu men, some people from, I think, Denmark, and Japanese fishermen. And it was this group of 50 men. This was back in the 1950s. And they said, all right, this BMI is good enough. And then We did more studies and said, I think it's good enough for women, right? And that's just where we've been. That is where we've been for decades. So today, the BMI is good enough just to kind of open the door to start the conversation. Like, all right, we see that you're maybe on this threshold, maybe you have excess weight, but why don't we dive in further and talk about what that means as far as overall risk? Let's look at your blood pressure. Let's look at your cholesterol levels. Let's look at how you're moving and your function, and can you walk up a flight of stairs without getting out of breath, et cetera. And then if we do an intervention, let's talk about what the goal is. The goal isn't about getting this BMI in a normal range. It's about all of those other health conversations.
I think that's a good point to end on before our Q&A. So thank you for your patience. Go ahead with your question.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and sharing your perspectives and expertise. So I work in healthcare marketing, specifically social media. And as you could imagine, there's a lot of talk and chatter and conversation on social media around the Make America Healthy Again movement. And while that's well-intentioned, it's often overlapping with a lot of misinformation and disinformation. So I'm curious about your advice to me or people in positions like mine when we're competing with these very loud disinformation campaigns and also trying to share truth about weight loss medicine.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. Like, what are the metrics you should use for evaluating what you're seeing, all the information that you're seeing out there on these medications? Let's start with you, Beverly.
Yeah, I'm on social media, so I'm on X, and I hear all of that all the time. So much information out there. You don't know if it's misinformation, disinformation. We just have no idea. I think you have to take in what you can, but then bring it to an expert to discuss it and ask, like, I read about seed oils online. What is your take on it? And in that way, you can start to develop different opinions. If you have the time and you want to dive deeper into the actual research behind it, do so. I actually play around with a lot of the AI engines nowadays, and they're pretty good, I will say. They are pretty good, and you can use that as a tool as well. The main question for you is that even if it's true, does it apply to me, right? Even if this, if we're not eating red meat here, and that's working for this person and this study, does that fit my lifestyle? Does it make sense for me? That's a question that you can only do with another expert on board. And a way to find that expert can be tricky too, because I think on social media, it seems like the person with the most followers or has the most channels and is the loudest person is the expert. And that's challenging, definitely, because I think that can be skewed from a marketing standpoint. I would flag that if you're interested in weight specifically, you can go to abom.org. That is the American Board of Obesity Medicine. And what they do is they have doctors like me go through a whole exam again. We take 4 hours. We sit 4 hours and take another exam on top of our other 10 years of training to prove that we are certified in obesity care. And I think that's one layer of legitimacy that you can ask any of the experts you run into to make sure the information you're getting is real.
Do you want to go to the next one? Dr. Tchang's.
Okay, yeah. Next question.
All right. Hi there. My name is Angela. Thank you for the time that you've given us today. I really appreciate your perspective on individualization and personalizing one's journey in weight loss. I was interested in your opinions on how you approach this individualization. As we know, many people are hopping on the GLP-1 train. I want to lose weight. Give me the GLP-1. I'll go to like a third party to get this GLP-1 when they don't necessarily need it. So I think triaging might be helpful. So looking at, okay, what is a type of person that falls into, you might do well with lifestyle management versus actually you're a perfect candidate for GLP-1 versus oh, we might need to support you a little bit further and provide you with guidance to weight loss surgery. So I would love like different perspectives on how you might approach triaging. So that way, for the lack of a better way of saying this, we're not wasting our time as healthcare practitioners saying, okay, let's give you the GLP-1. Okay, you know what, let's throw you into surgery right away. So I'm gonna step to the side, but I'd love your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I think you're better.
I'll take this because I see patients all the time, but I think that's a great question. The crux of it is the person who shows up in front of you, you want to give them the best thing you can. And whether that's surgery, medication, or lifestyle, oftentimes it's having all of those on the table as options and really discussing with them which one might make sense for them. The triaging process, certainly for individuals with really high weights, BMIs in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, et cetera, you definitely want to have bariatric surgery on the table as an option to discuss, not something to push them towards. But that's because with our weight loss medications right now, the best we can get is on average 20%, right? And that's maybe like 40-pound weight loss. And for someone who's looking to lose 100 pounds, maybe the medications aren't going to be the shoe-in for them. So I think the triage question, the first question you should ask your patient is, what is your goal? If your goal is 100 pounds, then you need to open up those options to them.
Okay, next question.
Hi there. Thank you for your time today. I'm curious if you can each speak a little bit about compounding and your perspective on it, because I feel like it's a tool that a lot of people are reaching for. And I've heard a lot of anecdotal conversations of, people finding $25 syringes online versus going through their actual physician who is suggesting compounding.
Great question.
We were just talking about this earlier.
Yeah, full disclosure, I'm an advisor for both Novo, who makes Wegovy, and Ro, which is a telehealth company that sells compounded semaglutide, not anymore or soon. There's a lot of law issues going around that. But compounding, I think, is an underutilized, underregulated resource. Honestly, if we are faced with a medication shortage, whether that's semaglutide or Adderall or children's Tylenol, we should be able to, from a centralized point, leverage any resources we have to support and fill that void, to fill that need. But it has to be done in a safe way. And the problem with compounding right now is that it's variably regulated on different state levels. And so it's hard to separate the good apples from the bad apples. So you talk to your providers, you try to do your own research to look at, is this compounding certified? Are they giving me a certificate of analysis? I'm on social media, and I've talked about this before with a little checklist that you can send to your compounding pharmacy, like 8 questions. Are you doing this, this, and this, and this? And if they ghost you, then maybe we should move on and find a different compounding pharmacy.
And of course, now that's become moot because both drugs have come off of the shortage list, which means that technically, right, legally,
they're all illegal right now.
They're illegal, right.
There's, I think, a little bit
Compounding
of a grace
pharmacies are not
period
either, so.
for semaglutide still, but tirzepatide, it should be illegal. And we are going to be kicked out, it looks like.
Right, yes, we are. So Stefan, Punit, and Beverly, thank you so much. Fascinating conversation, I'm sure.
Thank you, everyone.